To be at home is a place that is fun, a place that is safe, a place that I like to share with others, and I enjoy being there. Yeah, so it's a good place. And one of the things I was thinking about in having a dialogue was, you've heard often this thing about there's a difference between having a house and having a home. And what is it that transforms a house into a home? And so to help think about that, I was just thinking, what is a time in your life where you moved somewhere or went somewhere new and there was that moment that it was no longer just a house or an apartment, but it was your home? What makes it your home? And for me, I've moved a lot, especially growing up, but the first meal that I cook, and when the smell of the food is in there, of some favorite dish, that's when it begins to kind of transform into feeling like, this is my place, this is my home. So
for me, a home is a place of relaxation where I can be myself, find myself, and find peace also. It's also a place where I disconnect from my usual duties in work or anything. So it's a place where I feel it's my space. And for me, when you talk about house versus having a home versus having a house or an apartment or so, being from another country, moving to Pittsburgh, I didn't know if I wanted to live here because it was very different coming from Mexico City. It took me basically 7 years to realize that I could buy a house because I finally got adjusted to be living in Pittsburgh. The main reason was the weather. But now I actually enjoy the weather. I actually enjoy the seasons because I find that my life changed, meaning that I actually get something to do in every season. And it's something that as you live here, you just embrace that. So it was really in one of the trips that I came back to Pittsburgh when the plane landed, and I felt, I got back home. And that's when I realized that I needed to buy a house. So I decided I was going to buy a house, and so I'm happy. Now Pittsburgh is home for me, not just my house, but it's home. I have lived more of my life here than I had lived in Mexico. So it's difficult because at some point, for those that are from other countries, you try to find yourself between, you are from there, but then you're from here too. So you eventually, I guess, you start to be more from here. Nevertheless, you stay connected with your roots.
And my name is Awais Malia, and when it comes to home, and first I was born in Somalia, and that was home. I left Somalia, I came into the refugee camp in Kenya, and then despite the living situation over there, and our home was like bushes, and it wasn't that more beautiful or did not have any rooms. So it was like maybe 5 of us could sleep under the ground with a mat, but when my parents, and we all lived in the same kind, but we as a children, I was being asked, and where do you go at the end when we play? We all say home. So that was home. And what makes home is the welcoming to me, and even though some people say, oh, that's like a bush or something, but it is a home, and we had our own privacy. And when it comes to Somalia, and it wasn't that much difference, and we didn't have like rooms and anything like that. But again, when people ask us, where are you going? And at the end of the, whatever we were doing, and we will say home. So we came into a city after our village, and also we lived in bushes, but despite other people living and in different other condition, or are living better in a better houses than us. But at the end of the time, each of us will say, I am going home. So coming to Pittsburgh is where we find ourselves in homes or houses that has each room, each bedroom, each bed or things like that. And when we faced the eviction I think the eviction of the whole community in the Lawrenceville area is when again many people question if this is home or because we thought that this was home, but again you have these evictions, not only one person but the whole community. And again, that really remind personally myself to say, was home in the refugee camp or home was in the village that I lived? And I couldn't know up to today, and this is really a tough situation for members of our community. And when it comes to rent, and most of our community members are facing and problems of renting because of their accent and whatever they are asked on the application, and the names that we have, Muhammad, Hussein, all these are really things that we are dealing with. And what really makes us a home in Pittsburgh is a question that we're still asking ourselves as a Somali Bantus, and as a people who are coming from Somalia, as a people religiously a Muslim, and still we are really in search of our home here in Pittsburgh.
And I've moved over 25 times, but I've always gone somewhere that speaks English. I've always been able to use Google. I've always been able to find what I need. And I work with refugees, and I actually just came from a brand new refugee who arrived last week. And when I come into a refugee's house, I'm always really excited when they start to make their house a little bit messy, and when they start to move the furniture, and when they start asking questions of where they can put the curtains and where they can really start to lay roots. And it saddens me that you had to find a home and then you lost your home. That is unbelievably scary. And I think that I have the utmost respect for people who move to a new country, because it's simply hard. It is just hard emotionally. It's hard on your family. And so I just want to tell you I have a lot of respect for your journey and for listening to your voice. I'm very happy to hear it tonight.
Thank you.
Inhabiting a place and our connection with nature and the ways our social system and our economic system affect our ability to connect with the place that we live. One of the authors used the language of how can we inhabit a place, not just live there, but be a part of a community. And I think thinking about home for me means having a community, having neighbors, and feeling comfortable in the place. And increasingly for me, having green space around is really important, and birds, so some trees and things that draw wildlife to the place that I inhabit. But thinking about your experience, ways, and what we were learning in class is the ways our economy makes us mobile as people. So you moved 25 times. Jarrell, you've moved a lot. I've moved a lot for work. We have an economy that doesn't value home, or it doesn't, and it also doesn't really allow us to become inhabitants of a place where we can really have deep social roots and connections, not just with the people in our neighborhoods, but with the natural world that we share our home with. So one author made the really disturbing observation that our economy is making us all refugees in some form. Obviously, some people have worse conditions than others, but we're all becoming less and less connected to place and community.
We've been starting to get families of 10, mom, dad, 8 children. And frequently landlords ask me, is that legal? And it's like, yeah, it's legal to live with your parents and your children. Like, of course we can have 10 people in a home, and I think that just goes off of it. The economy is not allowing families to exist. It's not allowing large families. It's not because people don't want more children. I think it's just making it, squeezing people into smaller and smaller boxes of opportunity, but also of housing and of places to inhabit. And I think that is a very small scale and large scale way to think of things.
And I had been thinking about this leading into it in the couple of days before, that I feel like I have the luxury that I could, as a white woman in America, I could move anywhere. And there's so much privilege in that idea that, like, regardless of, what city that I might say or set my sights on, and that's not a privilege that everyone in the circle or everyone in this room shares. And that, I think, for me, is like the difference between a house and a home. That certainly, like, when I bought my house, there's those moments when you're like, oh man, like, I haven't put the things away, or like not everything has a place, and it's just a place you come back to. And then eventually it is home, but I've always felt safe there. And it's always been mine, and I always felt like I belonged, and I've never questioned whether or not I belong. And I think that absence of that question for me is a luxury that I've had, and I think it's really important for all of us to recognize that. I'm gonna say, Maria and I just had a meeting last week, and you said, like, something to the effect of that, when you were first here, you heard somebody speaking Spanish and you were like, oh my God. And I just kept thinking to myself, what a privilege that I have, that I haven't had to reach for that, for that community. So thank you for sharing that and for letting me expose you without telling you that I was going to. So.
Well, for me, right now, my home is my sanctuary. Is where I can identify myself, the things that I like, the things that I pick up, something that, as I said, something that identify myself. It's priceless, and yeah, that's what home means to me. Also, as Becky is saying, always hearing someone sharing traditions, culture, language, food, all of that kind of stuff that brings you something, a little piece of your culture. It's refreshing, yeah. And yeah, we never value that much, but when everything is taken away, it's like, it's really when you realize all the treasures that you have. Yeah.
Some of the families, just like you, that we see, they move to Pittsburgh, husband and wife, one child. Very easily they can have an apartment, no problem, usually. 2 years later or 3 years later, 2 children, no problem, they can still live in 1-bedroom apartment. 4 years later, 3 children, and they start thinking, well, I need to move. 5 years later, the children have been growing up. One of the children has to have his own bedroom, and they're getting nervous because they can't get apartments, 2-bedroom apartments or 3-bedroom apartments. And what they really want is a house. Even if it's a rented house, they want to call it their home. And they can't get a house for many reasons, because they don't have enough credit history. They don't have many things that many landlords require to rent a house. So it's very difficult for those families to have a home, what any of us will have very easily.
It's hard to think of home without also morphing into community, because if your home is not in a place that is related to the things around it, it can determine whether it can be a home or a house. And so when we start thinking about community, I was thinking here of, I grew up in Pittsburgh, and how neighborhoods are different now. Before, there was much more common ground of background of people who would live in the same community. And now when people come from different communities to a place, it requires a different mentality to make it a community. And a mentor early on taught me this word, intentionality. You have to be now intentional to build relationships. And your story was very impactful to me as well, because the trauma of one person being evicted is one thing, but for a whole community to be evicted must have been very painful. And yet you're resilient, you're here. And so how did you survive that? And have you found a sense of community where others are extending that those intentional relationships with you?
It was in 2005 when the episode of the evictions started, and the city housing authority has responded with money, volunteers, and also non-profit organizations. And I believe there was like a Pittsburgh Refugee Center, and that was much involved. And the reason was employment. And it wasn't like, and I don't know if I can put this, but in a way that is appropriate, but and most members of our communities are educationally, and I mean, we are really behind when it comes to education. So, and the evictions were due to the rent being increased, and then it's when families find themselves really struggling, and the resources with refugees and service providers was not enough, and the government funding for and for refugees was not also enough. So the only option to prevent that mass homelessness was really the housing issue. I mean, the housing assistance. So, and does it affect the community right now? And I think it was in 2014 or 15 when again, and I had a family member who was supposed to be settled here in Pittsburgh from Kakuma, Kenya. So, and because of housing here, which was really, to me, and it was really sad for members of our families, And because of that housing, they settled that refugee despite not having a family member in Erie, Pennsylvania. They couldn't settle this individual with a very big family in Pittsburgh. And when I asked, they said even immigration know that they couldn't find the size of house here in Pittsburgh for them to rent for a couple months because of, and they were supposed to get like at least 4-bedroom, but it wasn't successful here. So instead they said that they settled them in Erie. So the only, even for those who are coming from different cities and that or who want to live here in Pittsburgh, there is no way they can get a house for rent. So the only option whenever a family comes, even from Africa to here or from another city, the only option is housing. So which is not really, and there is no money options for rent here. But we get a couple and people now who buy houses, and we got a couple family members who are now in the real business or starting, small business and in selling and helping people buy houses. So maybe that will help.
In the work I do, the activist work I do around housing, we point out that in the international community and international law, housing is a well-established and well-recognized human right, which means that everybody should have access to supportive and safe quality housing. But clearly, there's no intentionality in city policy of making sure that all residents have that. And in fact, the direction that current policy seems to be going is to privilege people who want to move here with more resources, and to sacrifice residents who can't afford the rents. So we're sitting in a circle with housing advocates. So I wonder if we could imagine policies that had intentionality of making Pittsburgh home for all the residents who are here. And what would that look like, or how could we better achieve that kind of intentionality in our city's policies?
So to touch on your point of intentionality, I am not originally from Pittsburgh. I came here for college from Ohio, kind of rural area. So to a lesser extent, finding community was a little bit more difficult for me. Didn't really know anyone, and I was fortunate enough to put myself through college, so that helped. But more recently, I've discovered everyone leaves after college. So with your idea of intentionality, I've always grown up with a garden. So my family, we plant a big garden, and my dad always made it a point to plant more than we always needed, which didn't really sink in until I grew older, that essentially you plant some for your neighbors as well. We had a neighbor who had a peach tree. We would essentially trade tomatoes and get peaches. We had another neighbor who grew cabbages, et cetera, et cetera. So it was very interesting to come to Pittsburgh and see all of the community gardens and everything to kind of draw a sense of community. One thing, back again to the intentionality, is I feel like that is a space, or at least it was for me, where I could intentionally go, and it put me in a space where I could meet others and develop friendships and diversify those that I surround myself with. So again, to swallow my nerves essentially and put myself in that position was a very intentional and honestly kind of scary moment. I guess I would say you feel very visible when you do that. But yeah, I found it very rewarding to go out on a limb like that, or at least for me to go out on a limb like that and put myself in a position where I could both provide for myself and then essentially for others as well.
think with intentionality and with choices, it comes back to something I was teaching my clients today. Time is money. In America, you don't have time. You don't have time to be friends. And the people who need the affordable housing, they're putting in tiny little corners of the city, and then they have to take 2 buses and spend 4 extra hours getting to and from work for a job that doesn't pay enough, that doesn't have benefits for their family. And they start to get a little bit demoralized because they don't have time to build community. And so if we can't place someone close to their community members, close to people who speak their language, and by close I mean less than a 5-minute walk, they're not going to see anyone because it takes so much time to adapt and to survive with the cost of housing just across the city.
And with constant cuts to bus lines.
Yeah, the changing bus lines doesn't help anyone, and they keep cutting it, and then you have to wait an hour, or then they have buses that 4 buses show up in 5 minutes, and then you wait an hour and a half for the next set of 4 buses going to the same place. So it's sort of a rock and a hard place. And for people who don't speak English, I'm always very aware of how much power English has. I can't imagine being able to mentally survive all of the limitations and the boundaries. And I think that it's sad that it falls on community members, people who are struggling themselves and who are exhausted themselves, to have to pick up and help the other community members, when it would be nice for the rest of Americans and for the rest of us to be able to share intentionality and to make systems that are better for all people regardless of their vulnerabilities or boundaries, not boundaries. Blockages, barriers, thank you. Words are fun.
Intentionality with hiring is massive. You know, this is a really white city, and it's not particularly welcoming to communities of color, whether they be immigrant, refugee, or, you know, native to America. And it's just, we have to make intentional choices related to the hiring practices that we participate in. It can't be a 2-week search, because it's just not viable. And we have to be reaching out to our community members and searching longer and harder, and not allowing us to just fall back into these implicit biases that are so easy that, you know, we can just say, oh, well, we just didn't get any candidates of color. Like, really? Are you sure? Because this is weird. So yeah, I think because, you know, stable employment is also going to help people with these aspects of stable housing, building credit, and allowing people to get towards that. If ownership is their goal, there's a lot of pieces that are part of that, and stable employment is a really big one.
We're going to take this time to process all of this information and to generate some really thoughtful questions. Keep in mind that these questions will help steer the next half of this conversation. So I want you to all think about, like, what is it that you really want to hear? And what is it that we really should be talking about right now?
First question is, what is Pittsburgh doing right in terms of equitable housing practices? And like I said, this question for my community and personally is tough to answer because still I see the difficulties of refugees who are coming and who are going to come in Pittsburgh if they might be finding any affordable housing. So I know that there the housing trust fund. Trust fund, and that is really there. And our community was involved, and in advocating of that. I don't know if that is going to be helping and in getting money affordable housing in Pittsburgh. But that's what I know about what is happening in Pittsburgh about housing.
How can we make public housing more efficient and accessible? And then someone asked about the long-term solutions for housing for low-income families. HUD or subsidized housing is short-term, but not great long-term. And could there be a program that models Habitat for Humanity of a lower-cost mortgage, but targeted for immigrants? And I think that program sounds great, and if anyone wants to start it, please do. However, I think that one of the things with HUD that is really, really sad is there's such strict guidelines and regulations, which I'm usually all for, but we come into the situation where we have a family of 6, and it is cheaper and only possible for that family to have 2 apartments where they can afford, as opposed to share one apartment where they have enough space in that one apartment. And so that does 2 things. That makes their life a little bit confusing and they don't understand it. And the second thing is they're taking away a housing for someone else who needs it. And so the contracts that are in place for housing aren't made to benefit the tenants all the time. And I think that putting tenants first and putting tenants in a place where they would be able to be connected to programs. And so when you put public housing in the middle of McKees Rocks, where you can't get anywhere and there's not a lot of classes and programs around for adults, then you're putting people there, you're saying goodbye, you're shutting a door on them, and then they stay there. Or they get kicked out because something small happens and the regulations say that they have to leave because of this. And so I think that HUD at a large level needs to be more of a low income with a build-up program, building people up and helping them move out and move into home ownership. Because rent at $900 and a mortgage at $900, a mortgage is much better, and people are much more willing to work their butts off for something that is theirs, as opposed to all of their money disappearing into just paying someone else.
So I don't want to be a real bummer, but for anybody that pays attention to this sort of thing, there's new FICO rules that means that basically if you're doing well, if you have a 700 score or higher, that your score is probably going to go up once they change these rules. But if you're somebody who struggles with making payments on time and somewhere in the 600 or below, your likelihood of your score going down is going to increase. So we're just gonna see larger gaps at this point where, folks who have been in stable means are just gonna, have more access to loans. The big thing with loans and why a credit score really also matters is because the rate that you're getting on your loans is based off of your credit score. So although from a fair housing standpoint and from a federal standpoint, you should be able to still get an FHA mortgage with a 580 credit score, most banks won't do that. Their threshold is about 620. And it's just going to make it harder and harder for folks who are struggling to make these payments. Every time you miss a payment, it's just going to push you further and further below that 600 point. So yeah, it's making sure that it's a lot of aspects that we need to make sure that are being, a lot of care is taken when we're looking at these policies, because it's going to make it so much harder for people to get into this homeownership standpoints when they can't even get a loan to get there.
I just remember that we bought our first house with that loan, and it was hard to know about it, but we just found like a workshop in some wall, and we are like, oh, let's go there. And just because of that, we were able to go there and go through all that process. But if we didn't run into that, it's very hard to even know how it works. Because it's different culture, you don't know anything, you don't have credit, you don't have money, you don't have a job, but you want something. So also to get that information is so important, but when you are new in the city, it's just like, where do you get that?
Maria and I have been working on something that we're really hoping to get off the ground because so I work for NeighborWorks and we provide home buyer education. Like we try to help people so that people are getting into stable and sustainable housing, but it's pretty hard to provide assistance to communities that you don't speak their first language, and it's kind of silly to go in there thinking that it's going to work when you have those barriers, you have those cultural barriers and those language barriers. So Maria and our organization have been working on trying to figure out how we can, not just as an organization with all English-speaking employees, come in and provide the education, but how can we train Maria to provide that education in Spanish to community members themselves. So to expand the type of education that's available that is more comfortable because it's already more familiar, it's already part of your community. I think that's just so valuable because you only have a certain reach at a certain point, and obviously PHTC and Maria have a much wider one with the Hispanic community. So.
They talking to us like we're like dumb people, like okay, like talking to us like like it's not our language, but it's not that we don't know. Yeah. So it was very informative, but at the same time we felt like why they are treating us like we don't understand, So that's great.
Just to complement that part of that class that we had, it's important to know that people, at least in my culture, they are very shy, or they don't have this anger to develop. Maybe they want to have the knowledge, but they don't know how to approach to that, because they would say, oh yeah, I want to own a house, or I want to rent a different house because maybe someone is taking advantage of them. I've heard a lot of stories about right now that this weather is going crazy. Is that, for instance, the landlord doesn't allow to put the heater, or maybe there's a leak, or there's something in the house, or maybe the roof is falling apart or something, and they don't say anything because they feel like, or either they don't deserve it, or they just are like, well, who can I speak with to solve this? So we are growing in our community, and we are starting to be a point where they can reach us out. And yeah, with the help of NeighborWorks, this is what we are looking at PHTC, like collaborate with different groups. And as we were saying, well, while we're having a break, knowing us, each other, and know our capacities, and don't compete with ourselves. Having like the community as we want the community to grow instead of just being like fighting or something between organizations. I think that's the most valuable thing. And yeah, when a lot of people ask us why the name is Pittsburgh, our name is PHDC, well, it's Pittsburgh Hispanic Development Corporation. And a lot of people had told me, well, but do you serve just Hispanic people? and they make us feel like a little bit like racists because our name says Hispanic. But no, we serve any people. It's just that it's to feel the Latino or Hispanic people welcoming and have like a spot where they will feel that they have a space that they will be served in Spanish or Portuguese. So it's just that it's the reason of the name, and yeah, that I think growing as community and being around this kind of organization is the thing that we need right now for grow the community.
Are there policies we could advocate for regarding housing reform that could help to keep communities intact? Have other cities done this well, and are there precedents we can draw on? So with the Human Rights City Alliance, we're part of a national and actually a global network of cities that have been organizing increasingly over in the 2000s around the demand for the right to the city. And this movement is really a response to a global trend of cities emphasizing economic growth at the expense of affordable housing. So this is a global housing crisis that we're in, and more world leaders are actually coming to recognize it as a crisis and trying to, some of them are trying to address it. So with the Human Rights City Alliance, that's the point that we are making with, we can't treat housing as a commodity, as homes are not real estate. They shouldn't be emphasized as investment opportunities. They need to be treated as a human right. And so that requires really different policies, and it requires a different way of organizing politically to advance something that really requires a fundamental change in mindset. So what we're doing is, well, we want to push for things like more spending for public housing and affordable housing, which would actually be reversing the trend in the United States over the last couple decades, which has been to privatize public housing and demolish public housing and turn it over to private developers. We know that story here very well in Pittsburgh. We've lost hundreds and hundreds of public housing units, and they've become privatized or put on the voucher program. So we need to really build political will for social housing, and that really means educating people around the idea that housing is a human right. The other thing that we're working on, and I think we can advance more in the near term, is a tenant bill of rights. And that's something that other cities have adopted, and actually some local housing advocates think that could be really helpful for tenants. And I think some of the folks working with residents know that giving tenants more rights, now landlords really have all of the legal rights, and we need more protections for tenants. Another thing that we can do, and really to help build the idea of housing as a human right, is to really think of ourselves more in connection with people in other parts of the country and the world. And we have an opportunity now. The United Nations has a special rapporteur on the right to housing, who's been a very vocal advocate for housing rights. And I urge you all to look at the website and read some of her reports. She's really sticking it to governments and demanding that they really fundamentally change. Her languages fundamentally transform the relationship between governments and financial institutions, to make housing a human right and to make that a priority in policy. So she's saying that she needs us to back her up. And to put pressure from below on our governments. We're trying to do that in the Human Rights City Alliance and make sure that our mayor and our city council member know what the special rapporteur on housing is saying. And we're also participating in the United Nations official review of the U.S. government's human rights record, which is taking place in May. So if folks are interested in that process, we want to lift up the human right to housing and how, where the United States stands there and where we think some improvements can be made. So really some recommendations about how do we really close that gap in affordable housing and make sure that residents can enjoy the right to housing.
Are there any cities that you know of where the Alliance has been successful with its policies so far? And has there been any sort of implementation of what you just mentioned?
In the United States, we're a young movement, but we're growing. So some inspiring places internationally, Barcelona. Actually, their mayor was elected from the ranks of the housing justice movement and has been implementing really transformative housing policies there. There's some other cities that I would have to go and dig up my notes, but there's other cities in other countries that are really shifting the approach away from a market orientation to housing towards a human rights approach. The place in the United States where I'm more optimistic, there's a growing network of black mayors in the South who are human rights advocates and who are really bringing human rights language into their administrations. And they're part of our Human Rights City movement, and we're actually in early process of building that network and helping support their work in their cities, but also to share the lessons from cities like Jackson, Mississippi, and Birmingham, and New Orleans. And we're all participating together in this United Nations review process, so that's been helpful for helping us build connections among human rights defenders in this country. So interestingly, the global process has created a focal point for movement building across this country and getting us to connect across cities. So stay tuned and get on our website, and we'll hopefully have more to share soon.
I'm really glad you brought up global, because I think I sort of have two thoughts. When we're talking about homelessness and struggling to have housing, I think it's really important to remember how strong the systems in place that are creating that. It's not an individual problem, it's a system problem that creates individuals, that puts the problem onto individuals. And I think that, the credit score, as you know, refugees come to this country in debt. They took out a loan to travel to the United States. And I talk to my clients and I tell them, hey, this loan doesn't cost you anything, there's no interest. Pay it slowly over 3 years. And they tell me I'm stupid and I'm crazy. They're like, why would I do that? I want to pay it off now. I don't want to have debt. Debt is bad. And the concept of having debt being behind is a bad, uncomfortable feeling. I hate it myself, my clients hate it, but you have to spend so much time working on an arbitrary credit score and making sure that you're paying, but not paying too much, and you're paying quickly, but not too quickly, and you have enough accounts, but not too many accounts, and you have to wait 6 years before the accounts matter. And it is such a difficult, absurd system, and I think that having conversations like this are really going to make a difference, bringing in the global perspective, and as something that I do constantly when I work with refugees is I realize my culture, Americans, specifically white Americans, get to live in this bubble where everyone knows who we are, we're very loud about it, and we don't have to question our culture. I don't have to make a decision to change who I am. But when you try to do that, when you try to realize your own faults, your own culture's faults, and you barter and trade with people who are different from you, you become a better person. I've become a better person because refugees are in Pittsburgh, and because I get to the privilege of working with them. And I think that, there's all these systems and all these intersectionalities, and it's just so vast that I think it's important to individually remember it's not the person's fault. Whoever's suffering from a homelessness or a housing issue, it's not their fault.
What actions can transfer vacant houses into homes for those that need it? Affordable housing, housing for homeless and transitional housing. And what can we learn from Pittsburghers who have made a difference? There are several programs out there that are designed for people who need housing, and there's varying levels of what actually works or not. But theoretically, there's this one resource called the Allegheny Link, and it's you can go to a website, you can look it up, or a phone number, and if you need housing, you can get on a list. The idea was that instead of having to call housing or services, instead of having to call around to all these different places to find a place, you could just call one number, and they would know where all the open beds are, and you could, find a bed for that night. And however, that theory doesn't always work out, and it's not always real-time data that they have. There are people that are looking for these houses that are abandoned and trying to find ways for them to renovate them, make services available so people could live in them. There definitely is a need for laws and tenant rights with homeless people. We're also dealing with some people who are squatting in places and then they want to stay there, and for them it's their home. And so what is needed is more dialogue, and then people who are intentional about bringing change. And so, yeah, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I just had a question related to that. It sounds like there are a number of different things going on. The problem being there's like no one central repository for all this information, and people are pretty much on their own to find out where the information is, if it even exists. So one question I have for you on this last thing you mentioned about businesses on the north side that were buying houses or fixing them up to sell below market value. Where's the information on that, and how could someone find out about it and what's going on?
Yes. Yeah, that is the problem. It's because you hear them one at a time. There's a large church on the north side called Allegheny Center, Alliance Church, and they are intentionally trying to do things within the community. And a couple of these developers and landlords go to that church, and so I know that they have pointed people to us and vice versa. But you're right, we do need to, we were talking about it earlier, this idea of there are a lot of hidden treasures around our city. The strength and weakness of our city is that there's all these little communities, and there's some beauty about those communities, but there's also, those communities can become isolated silos, and we don't know resources that are right next door, and there's almost a mental block that, if it's not in my community or not across a bridge or through a tunnel, it's as if it's a whole nother world. So we have to learn how to value the things that are around us.
Yeah. I think just maybe this is a question for Global Switchboard, is that, in my view, what sounds like it's needed is some central network to pull all these things together, either as an information repository or people like myself or others who want to get involved or get engaged, and how can I help? Yeah. What can I do? Where are the needs? What are something I as an individual or my church or my group can do to contribute to, because there's a lot of goodwill, I think, in the room. There's obviously a lot of goodwill outside the room as well, but there needs to be, I think, something to pull this all together. So I don't know if that's something someone can speak to here in terms of the networking.
Well, as I pass this on to somebody else, I'll say that I know that organizations are a good place because they've made a commitment with a specific mission in mind, and so find one of those to work with or to volunteer, and then you can become part of that. And then also just communicating around. And so I'm sure everyone around this circle be happy to have you to come in and get involved in our corner of the world, and then we can discover what's out there.
there's a program called Immigrant Services and Connections. It's Isaac, and it is a system where you can call a phone number in any language, and someone will call you back. It might take a few days, depending on how many people are in need, but someone will call you back, and they can do everything from, hey, I can call your doctor's office for you with an interpreter and make sure you get an appointment, to, okay, I'm going to send someone to your house, we're going to sit down, we're going to talk about your housing needs, and then I will show you 3 to 5 apartments. It might be less than 5, I'm not sure what the number is with our capacity right now, but I will help you as someone who doesn't speak the language or isn't as familiar go into the community and do different things. And so they help name an issue, they can help with it. And so for everyone who's come here, I think that this is the best way that you can be informed and to spread it around. And so I'm learning stuff myself, and I think there is an immigrant center, or it's supposed to be a center, so that people who don't speak English can call and can get directed at least to a different avenue. And it's also a really great place if you're trying to volunteer with immigrants and refugees or give back. They can also direct people a little bit. Yep, Isaac, ISAC, and our website has a few dozen languages on it, so it can be shared around. And I think that, so during the current administration, when it first started, there was a lot of volunteers. My agency was overwhelmed with volunteers, and I think that has started to wane away. People get busy. But from someone who took volunteership and turned it into a job or found a job that matched it, going as deep as you can in one specific role is really helpful, because you can get drained, and there's just, we mentioned, maybe 50 different issues and social justice issues. And so finding something that you're good at, that you like doing, try to find an agency that does something similar, who they can even tell you where to go, or they can direct you. And then, just find something small and then try to make ripples with that.
I just wanted to highlight too the land trusts in the city as an option and an opportunity. As a person who has had a history in financial services and wellness and like a home ownership and all of these different things, as well as in the nonprofit and social justice world, there is the little bit of me that goes, oh, I still want people to see home ownership as a wealth building opportunity, because it historically has been specifically for white folks. And it's people of color that have been really kept on the outskirts of that opportunity. And, certainly these are really big issues, right? The massive increases in home value in specific communities is not sustainable. It doesn't really make any sense when you think about what you're getting, but land trusts really are looking to, it's not you buy your land trust house and you walk away with nothing when you move. It's just market. It's not market based. It's really based off of keeping communities affordable and fair. And there's a lot of CDCs that are looking to expand out. I'm most familiar with City of Bridges, really great and interesting work that's happening there, and looking to expand. And so, recognizing this aspect of we are really insulated in terms of our neighborhoods and we silo, but City of Bridges is now looking to not just be, right, it started with Lawrenceville and then it expands to Morningside and kind of like expanding out, and with some of their additional programming, it's now something that can be taken citywide. So there can be land trust houses all over our community, and it doesn't have to just be in one specific neighborhood. And I think that's an inventive way to address these issues too.
I think we've had a really rich discussion tonight. We've had a lot of good information. And I think now we'd like to transition to the last part of our event to kind of close us off, which is sense making and action. And we're going to take this opportunity to think about and reflect on our own what matters, and so what, and now what.